On December 17, 1944, at 0530 hours in Honsfeld, Belgium, the engine of a Tiger tank coughed, sputtered, and died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper struck his fist against the turret hatch in frustration as the metallic clang echoed through the pre-dawn darkness. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, attempted to restart the 700-horsepower Maybach engine without success. The fuel gauge read empty, and the reserve tank had also run dry. Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen Belgian soil. Around him, the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, the Ardennes offensive, sat motionless. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers were paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper observed the abandoned American position ahead at Honsfeld, a critical supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly that fires still burned in oil drums and coffee remained hot in metal cups. More significantly, rows upon rows of jerry cans, the distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers, stood lined up across the depot, thousands of them. Peiper approached the stockpile with cautious reverence. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruhl, pried open one can and confirmed it contained high-octane gasoline. As his men began the frantic work of refueling their vehicles, Peiper walked among the stockpile, counting. The mathematics were staggering. 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push to the Meuse River, enough to potentially change the course of the offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months. However, as Peiper stood among this bounty, watching his men pour American fuel into German tanks, a crushing realization settled over him. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then this war was already over. Germany had not just miscalculated, Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. The context of desperation. 6 months before Peiper's discovery at Honsfeld, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the bloodline of the Wehrmacht, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The Luna Works, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, managed only 5,000 by September. The Blechhammer hydrogenation plants at Politz and Brooks were operating at less than 10% capacity. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production and captured Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American production. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics, while America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance. Major Friedrich Zimmermann of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had calculated the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach the Antwerp. Hitler allocated 5 million gallons, but only half was actually delivered due to transportation problems. The German High Command was betting the entire offensive on capturing enemy supplies, a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had constructed a petroleum pipeline system across France called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean, and the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system that delivered 12,500 tons of supplies to the front lines daily. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving 1.4 million gallons. They were accumulating reserves while fighting. The architect of a doomed offensive. Joachim Peiper was not a fool. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak's leaves and swords, and a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned that in modern warfare, fuel was more precious than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive. On December 14th, 2 days before the offensive, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt about the fuel situation. The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons, enough for 50 miles of combat operations. The distance to the Meuse was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from the beginning. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders. Tanks would operate in single file to conserve fuel. Engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes. The capture of American fuel dumps was priority 1, above even tactical objectives. The contrast with American operations could not be starker. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position, recorded in his unit diary that they had received their third fuel resupply of the week, 8,000 gallons, while storage tanks were already at capacity. The offensive began. On December 16, 1944, at 0530 hours, the German artillery barrage that opened Operation Watch on the Rhine used more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. Yet this impressive display masked critical shortages. Peiper's column began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. The roads, which on German maps appeared as highways, were narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Within hours, traffic jams developed as vehicles designed for the Russian steppes struggled through the Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, Peiper's first objective, they encountered unexpected resistance from a single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. 18 men who held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. During the delay, Peiper's vehicles sat idling, burning precious fuel. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered 20 miles and consumed 40% of their fuel. At this rate, they would run dry before the halfway point to the Meuse. The discovery at Honsfeld. The American supply depot at Honsfeld wasn't even a primary facility. It was a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, what the U.S. Army classified as a Class 3B depot, a temporary fuel station. But what Peiper found there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Gruel later testified that they found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline, stacked 3 meters high and extending for perhaps 200 meters. The Americans hadn't even attempted to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, especially the temperamental Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good, causing engine problems in several German vehicles.
As Peiper's men refueled, they made more discoveries. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping manifests in the depot office. He could read English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. The papers indicated this fuel had been shipped from Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, and trucked 400 miles to Honsfeld. The journey of over 6,000 miles had taken less than 6 weeks. Hoffman recalled in a 1976 interview that when he showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper, the commander read them twice, then crumpled them up without speaking, his face pale. Both men understood what this meant. Private Ernst Bauer found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would use in the entire offensive. Understanding Germany's fuel crisis. To comprehend the shock of Peiper's discovery, one must understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft for lack of aviation fuel. Pilot training had been cut from 250 flight hours to 60 hours. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. U-boats were fitted with snorkels to conserve diesel by running on batteries longer. On the home front, German civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo investigated black market theft of individual liters. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries were operating at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because they had excess crude. The push forward and further discoveries. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Honsfeld, Peiper's columns surged forward. They reached Bühlingen by noon on December 17th, capturing additional supplies, rations, ammunition, and most importantly, maps showing other American fuel depots in the area. But the maps revealed a disturbing truth. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads had a depot. The First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Peiper pushed on to Ligneville, where his forces would commit the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Even this war crime was connected to fuel desperation. Peiper later claimed he could not spare gasoline to transport prisoners. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot containing over 2 million gallons. Here was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse. But as the first German vehicles approached, American engineers were already at work. The Inferno at Stavelot. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach. His orders were simple: deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline in jerry cans stacked across 15 acres. At 16:30 hours on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard approached, Captain Brewster gave the order. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks and distributed white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Hinkle threw the first grenade, and the explosion was immediate and tremendous, creating a wall of fire that shot up perhaps 100 feet. Within minutes, the entire depot was an inferno. Peiper's lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterscharführer Weber described how the Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret watching the flames in silence for perhaps 5 minutes before climbing down. The realization was clear. They could afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to the Germans. The pattern of destruction. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Trois-Plans, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. In total, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons during the first week, more than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons was rooted in a supply system beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating round the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily. The operation itself burned more fuel than German Army Group B received monthly. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for First Army, recorded on December 18th that fuel receipts the previous day totaled 1,847,000 gallons, with 1,623,000 gallons issued, resulting in a net gain to reserves of 224,000 gallons. The pipeline network was even more impressive. Operation Pluto had laid pipes across the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain. A network of pipelines extended inland. The Cherbourg to Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved 650,000 gallons. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily, while receiving 8.2 million gallons. They were building reserves during offensive operations. The mathematics of defeat. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossibility of the German position became clear. At Cheneux, they captured another depot, 5,000 gallons consumed in 3 hours of combat. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile. Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, consumption increased by 40%.
Hauptsturmführer Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded that by noon on December 18th, they had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. They had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. They were operating at a deficit. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, knew Peiper's fuel situation. General Courtney Hodges ordered all units to destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. That same day, American C-47s flew 316 sorties delivering supplies to Bastogne, including 160,000 gallons of fuel. Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. The final days. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged defenders at Staumont, the fuel crisis had become critical. Tanks were being abandoned with empty fuel tanks rather than from battle damage. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons, enough for one engagement or retreat, but not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were preparing for January operations. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the coming month. The request was approved without discussion. The contrast extended beyond quantity. American vehicles were standardized for efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile versus the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon fully loaded. Parts were interchangeable and maintenance simplified. German forces operated a bewildering array of captured and manufactured vehicles with different requirements. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Each complication multiplied logistical difficulties. On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message indicating that a fuel convoy had been destroyed by Allied aircraft and no resupply was possible. He was ordered to continue with available resources. Peiper called his commanders together. Sturmbannführer Werner Pauschka was blunt.
They had fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers, while the Meuse was 30 kilometers away. According to Hauptsturmführer Gruhl's testimony, the Obersturmbannführer acknowledged that they had discovered they were fighting an enemy who burned more fuel to deny it to them than Germany had received for the entire operation. What they captured at Honsfeld, which had seemed miraculous, was nothing to the Americans. The realization spreading. This realization was spreading throughout German command. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, later wrote that when he learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk German capture, he knew the offensive had failed before it began. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydte, captured December 23rd, told interrogators that American soldiers threw away chocolate, while German soldiers had not seen chocolate in 2 years. Americans burned millions of gallons, while Germans measured by the liter. On December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at Gleize, his tanks immobile. American forces surrounding him, the 30th Infantry Division, 82nd Airborne, and 3rd Armored, had a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons for December 21st alone. Peiper had perhaps 1,000. Private First Class Richard McKinney wrote home that they had Germans surrounded who had run out of gas, and their captain joked that they used more fuel heating coffee than the Germans had for tanks. The American response. The American response demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak. Patton's Third Army pivot north required 350,000 gallons just for redeployment, considered impossible by German standards, yet accomplished in 3 days. December 23rd brought clear weather. Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties, each burning fuel at rates that would have grounded the Luftwaffe for weeks. P-47s consumed 300 gallons hourly. B-26s burned 200 gallons hourly. 1 day's air operations consumed more than Germany's entire offensive allocation. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 remained operational but immobilized. These were destroyed with remaining ammunition. Oberscharführer Heinz Goltz described how they drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total, while the Obersturmbannführer personally destroyed his command tank. Millions of Reichsmarks of equipment were destroyed by empty fuel tanks. Of 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Peiper, approximately 770 returned. They had advanced 60 miles, captured several depots, and discovered the truth about Allied logistics. The strategic impact. News of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through German command. On December 26th, Field Marshal Martel Walter Model received reports on captured American supplies. His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction upon reading the numbers twice. 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed rather than captured. Model concluded that the two sides were not fighting the same war. Hitler, informed on December 28th, refused to accept reality. Speer wrote that Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. When shown photographs of burning Stavelot, he claimed it was Hollywood effects. However, lower ranks understood. Grenadier Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote his wife that Americans destroyed more fuel daily than Germany received monthly, that they drove tanks like Germans marched, and that the war was lost. The fuel crisis was symptomatic of a larger truth. By 1944, America produced 50% of world manufacturing output. An aircraft every 5 minutes, a ship daily, a tank every 7 minutes. Petroleum production statistics were overwhelming. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union, 110 million barrels. Germany, including synthetic, 33 million barrels. And Japan, 2.6 million barrels.
The Axis combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum. Every major German offensive after 1942 had been constrained by fuel. Every American offensive was supported by abundance German planners could not conceive. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a revealing incident on December 27th. A logistics officer reported that weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was concern until someone noted this exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation. Psychological impact. German prisoners of war from the Ardennes were more shocked by American waste than firepower. Seeing GIs discard half-eaten rations or use gasoline for heating shattered morale more than artillery. Unteroffizier Kurt Reichhelm told interrogators that while they knew American production numbers abstractly, seeing soldiers waste more than Germans possessed made those numbers real. Every German who saw casual American abundance knew the war was hopeless. This knowledge spread through letters despite censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote that Americans washed clothes in gasoline, fed chocolate to dogs, and fired artillery for Christmas celebrations. The psychological impact undermined German racial superiority narratives. The question arose, how could decadent Americans possess such wealth while the master race scraped for necessities? Testimony from Nuremberg. During the Nuremberg trials, German leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel, as decisive. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel testified that while Germany had operational superiority from 1940 to 1941, by 1944 they could not move forces for lack of fuel, while Americans moved armies like chess pieces. Peiper, tried for the Malmedy massacre, offered revealing testimony. He stated that every decision after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. They could not maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. Americans moved freely, while Germans counted leaders. General Heinz Guderian wrote that when Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, meaning everything to him, but nothing to the Americans, the war was over. The significance of industrial warfare. The story resonates because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. Wars were won by production statistics, not warrior courage. The romantic notion of warfare died in the Ardennes among empty fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-1 in major categories. In petroleum, it approached 50-1. These advantages could not be overcome by superior training or tactics. America produced 324,735 aircraft during the war, compared to Germany's 119,807. Americans built 88,410 tanks compared to Germany's 46,857. But most tellingly, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany scraped together 33 million barrels. The final reckoning. On December 24, 1944, as Peiper's men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the magnitude of their situation crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons, seemingly miraculous, only to learn it was meaningless to an enemy who could burn millions. Unterscharferger Weber reflected in 1975 that finding American fuel that morning at Honsfeld, they celebrated as if winning the lottery. By evening, learning about Stavelot burning, they understood they had already lost. Americans had so much they could destroy what Germans would die to possess.
The 50,000 gallons was less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days, less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption. Major General J. Lawton Collins later wrote that the German desperate attempts to capture fuel revealed their miscalculation. They assumed Americans valued fuel as they did, as irreplaceable. They could not comprehend that Americans had so much they could burn millions rather than risk tactical disadvantage. The mathematics of the offensive. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons, 40% over allocation, with the difference from captured supplies. During the same period, Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft, but most devastating was the loss of illusions. Every German witnessing American abundance understood that Germany was not fighting a war, but participating in its own execution. Peiper's legacy. Joachim Peiper survived, imprisoned until 1956 for war crimes. In 1976, he was murdered at his French home by unknown assailants. However, in 1967, he told historian Henry Maull that finding that depot was the worst thing. If they had run out earlier, they might have retreated with dignity. Instead, they discovered Americans had oceans while Germans had drops. They discovered impossibility.